Okay, Chair Wilson.
Yes. Okay, so here we are. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on with the executive director talking about our hiring updates.
Thanks, Chair Wilson. Last time we met, I wanted to just run through a few things. We were about to issue our final recommendations to the city's executive order 203 reform plan. The board was very encouraged to see City Council use our proposals as a tool for improving the plan. We just want to note that this is a way that PAB can continue to provide useful research on best practices and community perspectives to inform your work of legislating our way to a reimagined public safety system. Since we last met, the PAB is open to oversight investigations into police practices. Our first investigation is looking at the policies, practices, procedures that led to the pepper spraying of a handcuffed 9-year-old on Harris Street. The second investigation is looking at the RPD's protest-related policies. These investigations are waiting for the city to release us with information we've requested, and our lawyers are reviewing the proposed memorandum of agreement, and we'll have updates for you on that process when those updates are available. When we last met, the PAB had just posted advertisements to fill the 2 open positions we have. One position will lead our public engagement work. The other position will take on the operational work necessary to build out the PAB. We're almost finished filling those positions. We have one conditional offer of employment out, and another should be going out this week. And we're going to be thrilled to be filling these positions with extraordinarily talented people who reflect our community and are deeply rooted in our community. We finalized a new set of bylaws last week that better reflect the PAB's true legal powers and duties. Those rules lay the foundation for our next stages of work, which will be to develop the procedural rules, disciplinary matrix, training programs, and other elements that are prerequisites to our opening our doors to receiving and investigating complaints. We plan on using our remaining funds from fiscal year 2020 and whatever funds we get from the state to perform this work as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Chair Wilson to discuss our budget proposal.
All right, thank you so much. Okay. Hold on just a second, please. Okay. All right, so
can we go back to what you presented, though?
Of course, President Scott.
So with the hiring update, you said the offer is going out now. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Give me just a sense of just some indication of why it takes so long to fill those jobs.
Yeah. Well, first, we didn't get as many applications in the initial wave as we expected. And so we had to extend the application period to get a lot of people. We really wanted qualified candidates. Part of the issue was 2 things happened. First, some of our initial top candidates, one of them dropped out at the last minute because of a family obligation. So we had to go back to the drawing board on that position. And the other 2 positions, I think hiring got delayed a little bit by what happened in February and March with all of the incidents regarding Harris Street, open door mission, those kind of things that we had to focus on that. With one staff just due to the hiring, it could be a little difficult, but I think we're in a really good place now to get those positions filled as soon as possible.
And you said that the offer is about to go out or something like that, you said?
One offer is out. They are clearing paperwork they should be clearing paperwork with HR. The other should be out this week.
Okay, and that is contingent upon what?
The normal city prerequisites in terms of, I believe drug testing, et cetera.
Got it. Okay. You also mentioned as you did your intro that since we last met, you've opened the oversight hearing or something on the pepper spraying incident.
Yes.
I thought that had happened before. That's been a while ago.
I think the last time we met was in January, I believe.
Okay. All right. You indicated also about you're waiting for information. So we're going to cover that under the information access thing because it's not quite that straightforward. Chair Wilson.
yes, can I go ahead and go on with the budget discussion?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. All right, so, okay. All right, so In 2019, where our Rochesterians overwhelmingly voted to amend the city charter to create the PAB. When they did so, they asked us to perform an immense task. The charter says our job is to ensure public accountability and transparency over the powers exercised by sworn officers of the Rochester Police Department. So that's taken right from the charter. RPD has existed for well over a century. The work of this $100 million organization has never been transparent. Its 700 plus officers have never been held accountable. What the charter asks the PAB to do is to be the first ever to scale this enormous mountain. So we really are climbing Everest here, and that's why we need your help. We know that we can't climb a mountain like Everest overnight. That's why this budget proposal isn't asking to change every aspect of policing, make every corner of RPD transparent, or investigate every possible complaint against an officer. We aren't asking to do it all at once. We're asking to start to climb and not get stranded at the bottom. We also know that the community is asking that the city to climb many mountains, to better provide responses to mental health crises through the PIC team, to expand access to jobs, to create more parks and recreation opportunities within the city. We have to scale all these mountains at once to keep our community safe, and a fully funded PAB plays as an important role in the public safety ecosystem as a fully funded PIC team. We really need it all. So Connor, can you go ahead and start the slide deck, please? All right, thank you. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so the city charter says that in drafting a budget proposal, we have to communicate what it takes to perform all of our many legal duties and resolve all complaints we receive in 90 days. Our budget proposal says what it takes by taking an evidence-based approach. It's true, Rochester has never done this before. It's also true that our duties are different from those of PABs across the country. There isn't a perfect blueprint for building the PAB. That's why we spent 6 months collecting data, examining best practices, and speaking to staff of PABs across the country. We know this proposal isn't perfect, but we also know that it isn't a guess. It is the framework built on the best evidence available. Our budget proposal uses this research to create a framework for providing all our legal duties and completing investigations within the 90-day framework. But it also provides what a number of city council members asked for, a price tag for each specific task the charter says we must perform. I'm going to walk through the budget proposal on a task-by-task basis to break down the costs of doing our work. So let's start with investigating complaints against individual officers. We plan to do this for your Bureau of Accountability, tasked with accepting complaints, investigating complaints, and holding evidentiary hearings. Before talking about the staffing levels of the Bureau, I want to explain why the PAB's complaint process is radically different from the one currently being used by the Civilian Review Board. So first off, the CRB, or the Civilian Review Board, does not investigate complaints. Instead, it helps people file complaints with the RPD. Sometimes it helps mediate complaints, something the PAB isn't set up to do. But for the most part, what the CRB does is wait for the RPD to investigate a complaint, reviews RPD's investigation, and choose to agree or disagree with the conclusions of that investigation. In 2020, it took an average of 8 months to get a complaint filed through the CRB to the conclusion of an RPD investigation. Now let's look at the process that the charter aims to complete this task in 3 months. Unlike the CRB, the PAB has to accept complaints directly, not merely refer them to the police. We have to investigate each of these complaints on our own. We have to confirm and identify the basic facts related to the complaint, like which officers are involved. We have to collect witnesses, video evidence, and forensic evidence. We have to interview the persons who filed the complaint, the officers, and the relevant witnesses related to the complaint. We have to issue and enforce subpoenas. And finally, we have to write a report on whether or not the charge the officer with misconduct and present that report to the full PAB. That's just the beginning of the process. With the full PAB decides to charge an officer with any kind of misconduct, we have to schedule an evidentiary hearing, which resembles what you might see for the public's reference on Law and Order. There are witnesses testifying, there's evidence being entered into record, there's a stenographer, there are lawyers, and there is a cross-examination. At the end, there is an opinion we write with factual findings and a disciplinary recommendation, or a disciplinary order if we get our full powers back from the court. And that's not the end. If the officer or the person who filed a complaint asked for an appeal, the entire board, all of us, have to conduct an internal review of the hearing process. Again, the board would have to issue a decision with factual findings and recommendations. So this is a radically different process than the one conducted by the CRB. Just like a criminal prosecution, our process requires investigative skill, evidentiary precision, and lawyerly rigor. In other words, it requires a talented investigatory staff, including investigators with law degrees and support staff like evidentiary specialists, people who gather evidence. Given the charter's 3-month goal, it's also a process that requires enough investigatory staff to process these cases quickly. So with that, I'll turn it over to our executive director to discuss how the calculated number of necessary investigative staff. Connor.
Calculating investigatory staff size requires answering some preliminary questions. First, how many complaints will the PAB actually get? But getting complaints is very, very different from investigating the complaints. You know, lots of people file complaints, but those complaints may not add up to anything. So the second question is, how many complaints are going to be fully investigated? How many are going to go through that kind of long process of gathering the evidence, talking to the people, doing the hearings, that kind of thing? And then how many staff do you need to resolve all the complaints that you're fully investigating in that 3-month time frame? Now, for the purposes of our budget proposal, we're only referring to this part as 30 days. That's what we're looking at, just doing that portion in 30 days, not the rest of this. That will take more time than, 90 days, 3 months. That will take more than the 90 days that we're allotting. So all we're looking at is, what does it take to do this part for those 120 things, 120 fully investigated complaints in 90 days. So the first step is estimating the number of complaints. Now it's, you could say the place to start is the number of complaints that the Civilian Review Board is currently looking at. And you can count those, at least in the year 2020, on maybe 1 or 2 hands, right? It's not a lot of complaints. Part of the issue, though, is that the number of complaints that come in are based on factors like whether or not the community trusts the process. Do they think the process is fair? Do they think it's quick? Do they think it's going to result in anything? Part of the creation of the PAB was the idea that CRB's process isn't trusted by the community. People don't use it. And so it's not a surprise that while the CRB gets maybe a handful of complaints now, even looking back 15 years, the number of complaints coming in were the hundreds. So, looking at the current numbers may not be the best way to come up with an estimated complaint number. What you want to do is look at the data and practices of other jurisdictions that actually have functioning police accountability boards that can investigate things and figure out, okay, in those communities, how many complaints are they getting with that kind of process up on offer to the community? If you look at those jurisdictions and you ask them what figures they might look to estimate complaints, they're going to talk about arrests. Why? Arrests indicate how active a police department's officers are, what they're doing, right? So a department that has the same number of officers but's making more arrests is going out and doing more in the community, not just anything, but doing more things that are likely to lead to complaints. It's not that every arrest leads to a complaint, but it's the idea that there's this activity. The more arrests, the more activity, the more chances for complaints. And data from other cities confirms a strong link between arrests and complaints. So this is a chart that Chicago's PAB came up with. You can kind of see how the number of complaints tracks the number of arrests year to year. In Chicago during this time period is about, for every 10 arrests you make, you should expect maybe 1 complaint. And you can see how that kind of tracks from 2012 to 2016. And so that's just kind of some data, one visualization to kind of represent this relationship between arrests and complaints. Now, when we did the math to figure out how many complaints we can expect to get, we answer all these questions, like what's the relationship between how many arrests you're going to make and how many complaints you're going to have? How many arrests will RPD make in a given year? How many complaints are going to be in your jurisdiction? For example, how many complaints are going to be filed against, sheriff's deputies as opposed to Rochester Police Department officers, right? And how big is the complaint backlog? Because when you open your doors, you're going to get a flood of complaints from recent times, not just ones that are moving forward. And so when we tried to answer all these questions, again, we tried to gather best data, evidence from other jurisdictions. And you get a range of options based on the place you go to. For example, with the relationship between arrests and complaints, data at other major boards that do investigations, somewhere between 4 complaints per 100 arrests to 8, maybe. And so we use a conservative estimate, 4 complaints per 100 arrests. We do a similar conservative estimate with regards to arrests. We use the lowest number in the last decade as opposed to the average, which is significantly higher than it was in 2019. Similar things happen with our, what percent of complaints are going to be in jurisdiction. All of this comes up with a little formula that comes up to 480 complaints per year. Now remember, that's just the number of complaints that are going to get shot at the PAB, not the number that we're actually going to fully investigate. So how many complaints are actually going to get fully investigated? Again, going through this process of actually rigorously going through, identifying the officers, collecting witnesses, video evidence, interviewing complainants, officers, the whole thing. How many get through there? Well, again, we can look at other jurisdictions to figure some things out. So we start with those 480 complaints filed. We assume that a quarter just get thrown out the door on jurisdictional grounds. We're going to assume that a quarter get thrown out the window on jurisdictional grounds. Again, for filing a complaint against the wrong kind of officer, or you just don't, it's not really a complaint, it's a commendation. Those kind of basic errors happen a lot when it comes to people filing complaints. So we throw out about 25%. It's like it is 360 that you're accepting and saying, okay, we're going to look into this. Of those 360, some jurisdictions, they fully investigate more than half. Some investigate less. Some, like New York City, only investigate a third. We take that conservative estimate and say, we're going to say that 2/3 of the complaints that we actually accept are going to be small cases that require really minimal investigation for some reason, right? Again, it could be a very conservative estimate here. And that leaves you with 120 complaints that require kind of a full detailed investigation. So now that we have that figure, how do we fully investigate 120 complaints in that 90-day framework? Well, we look to data from other agencies. And what that data shows is that there's a pretty strong relationship between the funding you put into staff and the decrease in case processing time. So in New York City, for example, when they doubled the budget for their police accountability board, the average investigation time got cut from a year to 6 months. So, there is a pretty clear, roughly direct relationship between the amount of money you have for staff, how many staff you have, how long it takes. So if you crunch the numbers, especially for the places with the best data like New York City, you get this idea of 1 investigatory staff for every 5 complaints you want to fully investigate in 90 days. And that number is based on an agency that has had its staff fully trained, that's been around for years, if not decades, knows how to do this very, very well. That's the figure. So in the context of a brand new agency that's never done this before, again, this is a fairly conservative estimate for what staffing would take to actually do this right. So given that kind of ratio, what you get is, given the number of complaints you're going to fully investigate, you want 24 investigatory staff. Now, what that means is evidence specialists to collect and analyze forensic data, everything from bullet casings to body-worn camera footage, and also the actual investigators themselves, people who would function similarly to what you'd have in a district attorney's office in terms of a prosecutor. That's kind of a similar kind of set of tasks, right? Because of the hearings process, especially. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chair Wilson to talk about the other parts of the Bureau of Officer Accountability.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So when it comes to holding individual officers accountable, it takes more than just investigating complaints. The charter says we have to have an in-person complaint intake office, operate an online complaint form, and run a complaint hotline. And we have to issue all complaints a tracking number, and unless we want to do everything by paper, upload and track the complaints in a database. We have to gather the aggregate data on complaints, distribute complaint forms to every government building in Rochester, and ensure that all of RPD's officers carry complaint forms, and work with government officials to know how to refer complaints to the PAB. Looking at the staffing structure of other PABs, we propose a complaints division staffed by 4 people, a director, a staff in charge or staffer in charge of complaint access, and 2 complaint administrators. In addition to accepting and investigating complaints, we also have to adjudicate charges against officers. Doing so requires helping the board vote on changing determinations, drafting subpoenas, recording and transcribing hearings, monitoring and enforcing hearing procedures, drafting panel decisions, facilitating appeals, and writing appeals decisions. To perform these duties, we propose an adjudication staff division staffed by 2 hearings officers and a stenographer. Those divisions are what we need to hold individual officers accountable. The budget proposal creates other bureaus to perform other duties, bringing back systemic change to Rochester's public safety system. So I'll let Connor address that.
Thanks, Chair Wilson. And this part of our work is addressed in the Bureau of Systemic Change that deals with these ideas of creating proposals and policies to reimagine public safety. So, the thing is that PAB has gotten asked tons of policy and practice related questions. We've put just a handful of these up on the screen. These are the things that Rochesterians regularly ask us, regularly ask each other about RPD. And these are some questions that can be, addressed to policing practices across the country, but a lot of them have to do with very specific things that happen in Rochester, whether it's the Puerto Rican festival, or how, we deal with our deaf and hard of hearing community, whether or not we're giving them, equity and access within our public safety system. All of these questions. And the important thing about it is that oftentimes what's happened when it comes to police reform is that these questions get answered very quickly without much evidence. Right. And so that's part of where we end up with things like some kinds of implicit bias or crisis intervention training. We don't know whether or not they work. We just kind of propose them and then embrace them. And so, what the PAB is supposed to do under the charter is to oversee RPD's policies, practices, procedures, patterns, and trainings, all the things that are at the heart of the questions that people are asking about RPD. And then creating, publishing, and tracking proposals for change that can actually address these issues in a way that the community desires. And then in addition to that, the PAB is supposed to draft and update procedural rules to bring equity into our own processes, as well as a disciplinary matrix to govern RPD's work. This is important because if we get disciplinary powers back, these rules no longer become guidelines, they become enforceable rules. And so getting this kind of thing right is more than just throwing out proposals or rapidly drafting up a disciplinary matrix. You have to do it right to make sure that it's both legally sound and sound in terms of actual operations of the police department. And so, the question is, how do you actually need resources to do this kind of work? Because for many police accountability boards have a similar set of tasks in terms of policy and procedure review, but they don't have staff or have minimal staff to kind of do this work. And so what happens in the context of an agency that doesn't have staff resources or expense resources to pour research and work into this kind of policy work? Well, we know by looking at places like Oakland's Police Accountability Board, there's a big audit that came out of it last year that goes into detail on some of this stuff. Oakland's PAB has a similar systemic change duty. They oversee a similarly sized police department. So there's a fairly good model to look at. They only had, it's recently changed, but they only have 1 policy staffer, right? They only review 2 to 3 policies a year, 2 to 3. And they can be as small as use of force reporting structures. So it's not necessarily huge policies, right? And they only issue 1 new policy a year. That's what Oakland's able to do with 1 policy staffer. The reason why is, and this is what the audit concludes, is that it's extremely time consuming to conduct the research and outreach necessarily to get the policies right. So that's how they do it. That's how they used to do it in Oakland without a lot of resources. But there are other models where their cities have invested significant resources in this kind of work. And we can also see what happens when you do that. So a model here is Seattle's Inspector General for Public Safety. It's kind of like the city's Office of Public Integrity in Rochester, except it's devoted just to overseeing one agency, the police department. And this headline is kind of an example of what that Inspector General's office does on a regular basis, uncovers systemic level issues, brings them to light, and suggests how to change them, right? So this one was about how their police department was systematically destroying DNA samples. So, in Seattle, what they have is an independent civil system level oversight agency. And the important thing is, yes, Seattle's a bigger city than Rochester. Its police department is bigger than RPD, but it actually, even though they have such a larger city, they make the same number of arrests as we do. In fact, over the last 10 years, Rochester Police Department seems to have made more arrests per year than they make in Seattle, which is something that the PAB absolutely wants to look into. They have about 12 staff performing oversight investigations and developing policy proposals. They produce about 6 to 12 policy and practice investigations every single year. You can go on their website. They're really, really detailed reports. They call them audit reports. Every investigation is accompanied by a bunch of detailed policy recommendations. And they do all this work, but they're not responsible for rulemaking. So they don't have the additional rulemaking responsibilities that we have regarding the disciplinary matrix. And that's important because when we look at other jurisdictions, whether it's Phoenix or New York City or Eugene, that have done, Portland, that have done this kind of disciplinary matrix work, you realize that that is also extremely resource intensive. It took New York City 2 years to develop their matrix, with many, many, many people working on it. Now, obviously, New York City is a much bigger place, so you can look at a place like Portland, which is closer to our size, and they still took, many, many months with many people to develop a disciplinary matrix. So this kind of work is resource intensive. And to address this work, we propose a Bureau of Systemic Change that's broken into 3 divisions: an oversight division that's responsible just for making RPD transparent by filing a request for information, interviewing officers, analyzing data, holding oversight hearings, and issuing subpoenas. This is something we talked with Dr. Alexander about today, Cedric Alexander, a former RPD police chief, about the need to have very research and evidence-based policy proposals. Otherwise, there won't actually be change in RPD. Same with the policy division, a policy division to kind of accompany the oversight division, to gather the community input, expert perspectives, research outside models, essentially look outside of Rochester, or at least outside of the Rochester Police Department, to get the additional information you need to come up with proposals for change. And then a rulemaking division, 3 staff members to do everything from assistant policing work, but also focus on crafting memorandums of agreement, procedural rules, and the disciplinary matrix itself. And so with that, I think I can hand it over to Vice Chair Dr. Celia McIntosh to talk about our administrative work.
Thank you, Connor. I thought you were going to give a quiz now for the council. No? Okay. So I guess I'll pause right there and see if anyone has any questions before I start about the information that was already presented. Okay. All right. So the final bureau we propose is an 8-member Bureau of Administration, tasking with fulfilling the charter duties regarding educating the public, running the police accountabilities behind the scenes operation, and ensuring our work is legally sound. The charter requires us to educate and engage all of our community in all parts of our work. We need input on our proposals. We have to take special steps to engage youth, people with disabilities, folks with limited English proficiency. We need to also create educational programs and conduct public surveys. We know that this work is essential. We have heard from the PAB is that without effective community outreach, your work will fail. Actually, we've heard that from other PABs. So no one will know how to file a complaint, basically, if we don't have the appropriate tools and resources. No one will understand or buy into your proposals for change, and your work won't reflect what the community desires. That's why we propose a staff of 5 people in our education and engagement division: a director to lead the charge, 3 engagement officers to help engage tens of thousands of Rochesterians each year, and a communication officer to help build bridges across Greater Rochester. The charter also requires us to perform a host of daily administrative duties. We have to create and maintain a website that functions as a clearinghouse for all the facts and data regarding our work. We have to train all of our staff and board members in a long list of subjects. We have to also publish reports, provide language access, disability accommodations, and perform basic operational tasks like preparing budgets, making purchase requests, dealing with human dealing with human resources. So to fulfill these duties, we propose a 6-person staff led by a director, a dedicated trainer, a translator, an informational technology expert, and 2 all-purpose administrators. A final set of charter duties have to do with ensuring our work is legally sound. All of the countless board members and board meetings and hearings, investigations we conduct will have to follow all rules and laws about confidentiality and public access. We have to conduct legal compliance training. We have to redact every report and piece of information we release to the public. We have to enforce ethic rules and make sure our subpoenas are filed correctly. To perform these tasks, we have a legal division staffed with a single lawyer, a general counsel. I now hand it over to Connor to discuss non-staff expenses and our vision of onboarding staff process.
Thanks, Vice Chair McIntosh. So, to go back to the proposal, it's not just staffing that you need non-personnel budget. And if you look at other PABs across the country, kind of regardless of size, there's a good rule of thumb that you need about 20% of your staffing expenses poured into a non-personnel budget. Of course, it depends on the city, whether or not you're being provided, with office space for free, this kind of stuff. But we kind of are assuming that, we're going to need additional office space to house these folks. And so, in our non-personnel expenses, we do everything from having a website and IT services budget, office space, equipment, legal services, like, the filing of subpoenas, court costs, database access, publicity costs, trainings and memberships and all those kind of things that are ordinary to the funding of an organization, we put right in the expense line. So the important thing here is sequencing, because, this $5 million, this proposal adds up to about $5 million in terms of staffing and expense costs, but that is for the full bore of paying each one of these personnel persons staffing costs, right? The full year of salary. But if you were to onboard, you're not going to immediately hire all those people from day one. Now, of course, the charter says you have to, talk about the full numbers, and that's why we're doing that. But we want to reassure folks that, there has to be sequencing here, right? And so if you look at the way that other brand new agencies get off the ground, they have to develop an onboarding plan once they confirm kind of what resources they're going to get. And so you can look at other agencies and take a look and see how long it takes to kind of bring on the number of staff you have. If you look at the federal level, the best example is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It took them about 6 months to bring on the number of staff we're looking to bring on. So that's the most optimistic level. But the really important thing to recognize here is that the PAB's budget proposal plans to investigate complaints before discipline comes back. Now, of course, I think it's very important, I think Chair Wilson's spoken about this repeatedly, that we have to have a discussion with the community about reminding folks what exactly we can and cannot provide if we open our doors without discipline. Also, like not having discussions about what kind of complaints you want to take first, because our jurisdiction is so broad that in theory you could take a complaint against any officer action that's considered otherwise inappropriate, or if it breaks the law or follows violates any rule. And so the PAB has to have a community discussion about what kind of complaints we want to take a look at first, to kind of narrow the scope at the beginning. And so at least in the very early months. And so, a very important thing here is that the complaint acceptance date, when you open your doors, depends on your staffing levels. So knowing a little bit about what is going to happen in terms of staffing and budget, that's important for kind of predicting, if and when you're going to open your doors. And so while we don't have a firm date in this proposal, to the extent that City Council, wishes to have a kind of date linked up with this budget and onboarding plan, that's certainly something that we can provide. And just to quickly overview the work ahead, using state funds and the remainder of the budget to develop all the groundwork that you need to do in terms of trainings, procedural rules, and initial disciplinary matrix, these kind of things. Developing a plan for onboarding staff, and then creating a framework for what kinds of complaints will be taken first. Something that I just want to, almost wrap here on is the idea that, this proposal does not account for disciplinary powers, does not include any kind of assessment of using discipline. Getting discipline back would not change the fundamental procedures of the PAB. What it would change radically is the number of complaints we get. So all the complaint estimates, almost all the complaint estimates we use, we didn't really use complaint estimates from Oakland in the formulas, though we definitely reviewed those complaint rates, is the idea that if and when you get disciplinary power back, there just is a significant more number of people who want to file complaints because they realize that there's something additional at the end that they have had a hard time getting. So if we were to get disciplinary powers back, that would change how many complaints we would be receiving. It's hard to predict exactly how many, given the low number of other agencies out there, but we know it would be likely a significant increase. And in addition, with disciplinary powers, there would be a significant increase in legal exposure. Because once the Civilian Review Board starts attempting to impose discipline, there is a strong chance that each individual complaint will be run through the process. It will go through the internal appeals process, and then an officer may choose to bring the case to court to review all the individual sufficiencies or insufficiencies that can come up in an investigation. And so preparing and acknowledging that requires, at some level, somewhere in the city's budget, a recognition that there's going to be maybe significant legal outlays in the future, even if you get disciplinary powers back. So what this all just means is that there's a likely need for more resources than what's in the current proposal if you do get disciplinary powers back. And so I'll kind of put it back into Chair Wilson's court to kind of wrap us up.
Okay, thank you. All right, so of course, because keep it in the wrong window. There we go. All right, so with all this in mind, I want to close by putting the $5 million price tag in context. First, I want to note that weeks before we released our budget proposal, a number of local organizations announced that $5 million was the right annual budget for PAB. These organizations include Rock Acts, Teen Empowerment, the Alliance for Quality Education, the Center for Community Alternatives, and the Rochester Decarceration Research Initiative. Second, I wanted to note that the $5 million we're requesting is less than what the city spends on parking administration, enforcement, and meters. It's also important to see that the $5 million is less than what the city pays in salary to the 34 highest paid RPD officers. The simplest way to see what we're asking for is this. In accepting our budget proposal, the city would be investing $1 in accountability for every $20 it's spending on policing. I call our budget an investment for a reason. Right now, the city is spending millions thanks to misconduct and allegations of misconduct in RPD. The city spent over $2.5 million on police overtime for policing-related protests in the last year. The city has spent millions over the last decade to defend against and settle police misconduct lawsuits. And if nothing changes, the city may also spend millions each year to pay a federal monitor to oversee RPD's work. Fully funding the PAB may seem to be a hefty price tag, but our work is sure to reduce the huge amount that the city is currently spending thanks to a lack of accountability. Investing in our work is just the right thing to do by the community, and it's the right thing to do really by the city's bottom line. I want to close and thank you all for listening. We are looking forward to discussing the details of our proposal and figuring out how to fully fund the work of accountability that our community has been desperately wanting and calling for. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, so we'll discuss the budget. You all know my initial reaction was sort of like sticker shock. And one of the things that kind of related to during the early discussions was to look at it like you would the DA, what the DA's office does. So I did that. I looked at the DA's office budget. Their budget is about $16.5 million, something like that. And they closed almost 5,000 cases last year. So we're talking about 5 million and doing 300 cases or something like that. So even putting it in that context is sort of hard to absorb. But I want to hear from, I know that Councilmember Gruber had some remarks or some thinking about what may look more achievable, put it that way. Councilmember Gruber, are you there?
Yeah, I'm President Scott. No remarks about what looks more achievable at this point. Still trying to understand a couple of things. Page 26, and you someone mentioned it in the presentation tonight, but page 26 references the fact that the PAB that quote, unlike many other agencies, the PAB does not need a complaint to launch an investigation. And I'm really curious about the thinking around that fact, which I think that there's probably some gray area to understand kind of what can and cannot trigger an investigation, which is something we should definitely talk about. But I'm wondering about that statement, which is part of what makes this board powerful, and the 90 days, because it seems to me like part of what is embedded in that paragraph there is that there might be this kind of impossible demand of cases to review. And this was something that we talked about a lot when we were writing the legislation, that there was always going to have to be some level of discretion about what is or is not ultimately taken on by the board. I'm just wondering for comment on how you see your ability, your kind of infinite ability to see cases, and this 90-day
Okay, so I'll answer that. Actually, I've mentioned in meetings with President Scott, and I think you, council member, a couple of times about, that's why I think the PAB is really very special in what it can do. Because, for instance, in closed meetings, we've talked about, the idea of, for instance, if you have a female that was mistreated by, we'll call it hypothetical, that was mistreated in police custody, and they were pregnant, and they ended up something ended up happening to the child, or the mother was put in danger by her interaction with police. However, because of that reason that she may or may not have a record, that they did not want to come forward with a complaint. So those are the things that we need to highlight when we're talking about policy, procedures, and practices, because if you take a look at a hypothetical situation like that, does a policy exist in which pregnant women are kept safe, or is there a policy and procedure that is highlighting to make sure that that's actually addressed in detail? And is there practices surrounding that, or does there need to be training on how to handle those types of folks in those situations that can go very left in a very quick minute? And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about highlighting some of those procedures, practices, and policies. Now, I understand that actually, yes, we can't go after everything, but when we have situations, remember, so you have folks that will be especially afraid to make complaints. But I get emails, and I get actually Facebook messages from folks in the community that are coming to me. They're coming to they're stopping me at the public market. They're talking about their incidences where we're looking for these cases where there are allegations of misconduct, and that they don't want to come forward and make a complaint, which they don't have to do. And there's also folks that would like to have issues addressed that are patterns of behavior that we're trying to pinpoint, that are actually pointing to a larger problem of a policy that we should be investigating. And so I think that that's what I'll say, but I'll leave it open to any other board member that would like to comment.
Can I just clarify the question? Because everything you said, Chair Wilson, makes plenty of sense, and please believe me, I like nothing more than for the PAB to be able to hear cases as soon as possible for the reasons that you stated.
Okay.
My question, I guess another way of kind of framing this is that there's a little bit of a supply and demand tension as part of the budget proposal, right? Like a lot of what's in there is saying, well, the demand is going to be huge. The demand is also not just from the community, but also the demand of the charter is huge because it has this 90-day timeline in it. So the demand is going to be huge, and the supply, no matter what we do, the supply is going to be finite. And here's a particular place where the supply being investigators, right? Because even I think in this, there's a proposal of 19 investigators. That's still a finite number of people. So the question is, what is the plan to mediate that supply and demand? If that question.
I'm going to have somebody, either the executive director or vice chair or any other council person or your council people, board people can answer that, please.
I'll just briefly state, I think we had a fantastic conversation with Councilmember Melendez a few days ago. We talked about the need for the PAB to have a conversation about how it's going to define inappropriate conduct with the community, right? I think, because the charter, voting on the charter, the citizens say, this is what we want. If we want to limit that or, narrow the scope in whatever way, I think you have to go to the community and say, okay, for resource reasons, whatever, we want to, at least for the beginning, narrow things or like just start in a certain way. We have to talk to the community about that. We also have to talk to experts about it. Part of the best part of, developing this proposal has been able to speak to experts in civilian review across the country, giving us information, testimony, data. And something that they, talk about is the exciting nature of the PAB's powers. Just to your point, Councilmember Gruber, that part of the charter that says that, PAB has the power to investigate in the absence of civilian complaints, it's pretty clear, right in the charter, 18-3F. And it's something that I was intrigued by when I first read the legislation. And so, I had questions, for you folks about what was the thinking behind, doing that, because it is unusual, but it's also something that other, civilian review experts find very intriguing, given the problems with potential witness intimidation and, people wanting to alert of problems, but not necessarily wanting to be the ones, driving the investigation. So it's a very interesting and could be a best practice, but I'd love to hear more about that from you folks. And we can obviously do that offline, given the time constraints here.
President, I'll just ask one more nuts and bolts question before I pass it off to other folks. Just a couple of questions about the positions, and Connor, I appreciate you responding to my email about that. But I'm wondering, like a translator, for example, or the complaint dissemination officer. I don't question for a moment the need for the functions of those positions. I do wonder about how some of the things could take up 40 hours a week if the caseloads are low. So, which I'm assuming there's always going to be an ebb and flow for these things. I would imagine that's what you've probably heard from other places. What's the plan? What do you do with a translator when you don't have things to translate?
I'm happy to have the board members.
I want to say something. Translator isn't just for interviews or intake. Translators are for materials in an ongoing way. So anytime we're doing reports, anytime we're doing investigations, anytime we're producing any material, anytime we're updating the website, anytime, there's always, it's an ongoing process. I don't see a time when we wouldn't need a translator in that sense.
And I'll just say that, we're currently using a contractor to provide, written translation, et cetera. It's extremely expensive. And, it's actually more cost effective, given the agency of this size, to have a full-time translator. And so the question really is whether or not the city wants to have the PAB's work be accessible to people who don't, speak English, because, and it's a question, do you want the major press releases, the major reports to be in Spanish? Maybe, if the city doesn't want that, but the city charter says that, we need to make our work accessible. And that's something we've heard people love about the charter. The fact that the PAB has such stringent language access requirements, because it's just not the case with regards to the rest of city government. So, this is a place where it may be burdensome, but it's a place where I think a lot of city residents would love that kind of dedication to language access and equity.
Councilmember Lupien, you have remarks?
Yes, I just wanted to say how much I I realize how much work went into this proposal. The research that you have done to understand the work and the amount of staff and the money that it will take to do the job that was set before you. And I just want to, give kudos for that and to thank you for that service that you've given our community. And in terms of the price, I don't really have a sticker shock when I think about that the police spent more than half of the budget you're proposing just responding to the protests, and that it has the potential to cost the city much more with the lawsuit that is now filed. And so I see this effort as a long-term benefit to the city in terms of finances and making sure that accountability is happening and we're not having so many lawsuits, but obviously to addressing the everyday injustices that happen. And I don't want to see the board have to say the small, quote unquote, smaller offenses aren't worth your time, because I know the disrespect that people feel in this community. They don't want that to go without accountability. It's all important. And, this department has really gone unchecked for decades. And I see the work that you have to do as monumental. And I would imagine that this amount will decrease over time as the department's policies and procedures, are brought in line with, and officers are held accountable. So I have zero problems with this budget. I think this is appropriate, and I thank you for the time that you put into it.
Councilmember Melendez?
Yes, thanks, Madam President. I have a question related to infrastructure and building infrastructure. So if this were to be something we considered and move forward with, what do you anticipate the timeline would be on your end to build enough infrastructure to support the level of staffing you're talking about? And how long to get it to the scale of fully staffed do you think it will take? If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I want to say that I think that and this is a conversation I hope to follow up with folks in the city's budget department at the state level, that $500,000 coming in from the state could be a phenomenal tool for making sure that time frame is shorter rather than longer. It is a rare thing in so many different communities. What you have is an old civilian review board that you incrementally build on. You give it additional powers, you give it additional staff year to year to year to year. What's happening here is you're wiping the slate clean and building something brand new. And to build something of this level of duty and power, it's not entirely unprecedented, but it's really rare. And so giving a super hard number is for that kind of when would we be opening the doors for complaints. I don't want to misinform people by throwing out a number without having a chance to speak more in depth with the people who've done it. So for example, on Thursday, the board's hearing is going to be hearing from the person who ran New York City Civilian Review Board, the person who created the training academy instructor's manual for Chicago's PAB. We need to hear from those people to give the kind of detailed timeline you're looking for. My initial thought is that, if there was a commitment from council or from the city to, fund the positions in the proposal, with all the caveats about, it takes time to onboard people, you might not pay full salary, et cetera. I would hope that the PAB would be able to open its doors for its complaints sometime in 2021.
Okay, one quick follow-up comment just for your consideration is that, we're talking about going from one staff member right now. I know you have the capacity to add 3 because you're hiring 2 more to 55, and I know that's a huge leap. So I would like to hear more about the plan to get to that leap in the next couple weeks, if that's something that you could work on. Thank you.
We can make it a priority, Councilmember Melendez.
Okay, Councilmember Who did I see? Melendez. Oh, no, you did yours. Was there somebody? Oh, Pio, Councilmember Pio.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the time here, and I appreciate the ask of the dollars there. I know it was kind of a sticker shock for me as well, but I do appreciate the fact that you're going for it. You know, I'd rather you say that this is what I need, this is what I really want, than come back next year and say, hey, it wasn't enough. So I do appreciate that. Something that I would personally ask for, I know the big thing with the PAB was not including a police officer. I would love to have maybe some of these investigators or someone that has a connection, knows what to look for, knows what to, ask the police, use the terminology that they use so they can really get eye to eye with the other police officer and really see who that person is, because I believe police officers do know other, police officers. And I really don't think that, I believe there are a lot of good police officers who want to see change. And I believe we can really utilize their help. So that would be my ask. Oh, and I had a follow-up question on the translators. So, or a translator, I'm going to guess it would be Spanish, but we have a lot of, Congo, Nepalese, Burmese, like we've got a lot from all over the place. So I'm going to guess we'd have one that's Spanish, since that's the primary, and then maybe have a couple that are on call. I would also hope that they are locally sourced if they are on call. Those would be my.
I guess we would also have to, what's coming to my mind in the medical field, we use like a Stratus. It's like a video interpreter.
Yep.
That has multiple languages. So I know we probably have to go back to the drawing board and talk about that as also a possible, in terms of what we're thinking, what that could look like. So that'd be something that I would want to discuss with the board as well and get pricing for that, because that would give us more of those options.
Yeah.
So-
And that's just,
I'm sorry. So Connor, I just want to say one thing as well. So we use that also where I work. And we also, we know that Catholic Family Charities or other agencies have historically used folks that were very proficient at speaking English that also could speak other languages that would go to people for appointments. And that, folks that were arriving in this town from, for instance, like 2013, when, we had a huge influx of people coming from Puerto Rico and they needed translating help. We had people that were employed giving help to those who needed it going to medical appointments, and that actually fed families. And so that's also something I would want to consider, because I know for me as a medical professional, I like the Stratus actually, because it's nice to see a face. However, it's nice to actually have somebody in person that, can tell me and sit down next to me with a patient and say, yep, here's what's going on, here's what's happening, and that they can understand how to directly relate to them in the office. And so I know that's just another thought to put out there, but I know that in this town we've done both, and I know that the other way has really really positively affected jobs here. So just wanted to offer that.
I just want to quickly respond. First, we include a staff position for a translator. We also include a translation services budget to provide the exact kind of services that you're talking about, Councilmember Pio. I also want to say that this work will fail without police officer expertise. Absolutely will. I think that's something the entire board agrees on wholeheartedly. It's part of the reason why we're having a hearing on the 29th to hear about the experiences of Black and brown officers on the force, because we need to hear from that ASAP. One of the things we really want is to have to be able to regularly be in contact with RPD officers just to tell us the realness. Just say, hey, how does this actually work? What does this policy actually mean? What's the actual training? If we just look at the papers, if we just look at we're never going to learn what it actually is. So we will fail without officers, and that's a priority for us. And that leads me to my third point, which is it's a priority for us to have local people, not just doing translation, but all of our work. And I think you're going to see that with our initial hires, and I think you're going to see that with almost all of our hires, is having people who are from here, who know this community, who care about this community.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you for everything you guys did.
Are there additional budget comments? Well, I know we'll be talking more.
President Scott,
Yes.
when you get done, I'd like to say a word. I'd like to ask a question.
Sorry. Yes, Dr. McIntyre, go ahead.
So I just had a quick question. I guess I know you'll be having this discussion with the rest of the council member, but I guess I just wanted to also take this opportunity to kind of figure out what price tag does sound appropriate.
Well,
After you've kind of heard everything.
yeah. So we would need to, I don't know, come up with something, but I still, though, that comparison between the DA's office and the PAB, that was kind of striking to me. The number of cases, because we look at what we're projecting and saying that it's sort of the same process with investigators and attorneys and all of those people, but their budget is, as I said, it's a little more than 16 million. They closed almost 5,000 cases. So I can't sort of approximate that.
Can I respond to that, just because it's related to what she's saying, and I don't know what Board Member Brown needs to say, but Madam President, I think as you heard Connor say in his presentation, we're not going to have people that have been doing this for years or the experience that is required. I mean, we're building it. I think comparing that to comparing us to them is a little unfair, because they've been doing this. These offices have been running for a long time. So obviously they're going to be able to go through cases much faster than we can. I'm hoping that at some point we'll be at that speed, right? That we'll be able to resolve more cases in a shorter time. But I think comparing the two, something that is starting, that is coming from you, we're still all trying to figure this out, to compare it to an office that's been running for years, and people that have been doing that for probably all their lives, is not a fair comparison.
Well, I guess it's as fair as he made the comparison and I followed up with it. So I didn't just dig that out of the air. He put that out there trying to help us get a better understanding for this machine that we're creating. He put it in a perspective that perhaps we could grasp it more, that it will need all of these parts, and something that has all of these parts similar to the DA's office. So that's where the comparison is.
And I want to just follow up on that, but I also want to let Board Member Brown speak.
Okay, after you, Connor, because we'll stay in that same wheelhouse.
Okay. So on the district attorney's office, I think it's an important comparison on the singular point that you need attorneys to do this work. You can't have amateurs do it. That's the most important thing to think about. It's also important to think about the process. But I think the first thing is that the district attorney's office, they're just our Office of Police Accountability. So you can't compare the 5 million. You want to look at like the 2 point whatever million that we've got just in the investigations kind of unit. Also, because they don't have to do the adjudication work, or they may not depend. So it's really the complaints and the investigations. The other thing is that I don't think that the speed through which cases are processed in the DA's office is a good metric. I think that DA's offices rush cases and it does horrible justice, including, frankly, the Monroe County District Attorney's Office. And a lot of, they judge their success by number of indictments and number of people they get locked up, essentially, right? We don't want to judge our success by the number of police officers convicted of wrongdoing. We also don't want to judge our success solely by how quickly we can get cases through the door. We have to judge our success based on, and the charter says this, we have to survey complainants and say, how do you think we're doing? That's the way to judge our success. And so while we do have to be speedy, we also have to be fair and thorough. And that requires, frankly, maybe not being like the district attorney's office, because also when they close cases, they're offering plea bargains. We can't plea. And so I just want to, again, I think the district attorney's office analogy, you're right, it may not have been the right one to communicate the true parallel. It's just very important because there's often a thought that investigations can be done by people who just don't have the experience to do it. And that does a deep disservice to police officers who deserve an investigation done by qualified people who know what they're doing.
Great evening, everyone. One of the things that I'd like to bring to our attention is we're focusing a lot on the investigation. But our agency will be doing so much more to educate and empower our citizens. We have to get out there among people, not only to find out what their needs are, how we can assist them, but also to tell them what their rights are, so that we are all working together to move Rochester forward. We're not, it's just what we're discussing now is just one aspect of the work that we're doing. We will be in the community doing community things to help all of us come together, and not just disciplinary and good and bad police officers, good and bad policing. We also have to look at and help rewrite policy. There is a huge problem with some policies and procedures and things, practices that are being done now, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be here. The police department, we have been trying for the past 50 years here in Rochester to do something substantial to change what is going on. And I'm afraid we're still at not necessarily step one. We have made 10 steps forward and 5 steps back. But this is the agency that's going to propel us to the next level and help us move forward from there and not keep backtracking. We also have to look at seeking to change the culture of how we do policing here in Rochester. Because I don't care what you write on paper, how many policies, procedures, or whatever, if the heart of the people, those who are on the police force and who are in law enforcement does not change toward the citizens they have hired to protect and to serve, we're not going anywhere. So we have a lot of personal work to do, to work hand in hand with the police office, just as we are working hand in hand with the council to make Rochester as a whole a better, safe place for everyone in the community. I'm done.
Thank you. Were there any additional comments on the budget at this time?
I guess I'll just finish out then. I had talked to Malik earlier today, and one of the things he had talked about was envisioning the Police Accountability Board being a preventative agency, and I really liked that idea. That eventually, we are preventing, certain outcomes within the city of Rochester. I think about, oh, sorry, Councilmember Evans, thank you. That I really liked the idea of, we, for instance, our youth and our the task we have of having even a youth committee that serves on the Police Accountability Board, right? That we're not talking about just about what does preventative care and preventative measures look like, not today, but 20 years from now, when we have youth that are still trying to navigate their way through city life here in Rochester. So, and especially, all of you, you may not all of you know, but a person was shot right outside my door, or right outside my window yesterday. And, a man on the street that I was standing next to said, well, it's not even summer yet. And he was probably about 21. And I just, thought about him. And so I, really, I just have been really tasked with the idea of preventing these types of, I can't prevent, violence like that, not with, hopefully with this agency, but not really. We're looking at policy, procedures, and practices, right? But, really just about, what does it look like living here in the city of Rochester, especially if you are a young person. So just wanted to add that little tiny bit. And sorry about what I said about Councilmember Evans. Apologies.
Okay. So we talked about, well, you did mention about when we'd be getting the staff on board or filling the positions that are available. And on ours, see what our items are. So we wanted to talk about, we had not heard back from you about the attorney your participation in that process. What?
Chair
what
Wilson,
is-
do you want me to respond to that?
I'm sorry. Yes, can you please? I had a response and I'll respond in a second.
Sure. President Scott, I think that we'd like to hear as much detail as possible. I know we've seen a job description, but what the process would look like in terms of what this person would be doing for the PAB, how they would fit into the ongoing PAB roles, particularly now that we have a budget proposal out that shows kind of the amount of legal work that would just have to be devoted just to PAB's work. I think just solely in terms of redacting documents and reports that going out, that could just be a full-time job in itself. And so I think, now that we have this information about the proposal out, I think it's now we can have a little bit more educated conversation, maybe on our side, maybe on council's side, about how this attorney that is supposed to be dedicated to council's work, would relate to the PAB. So more additional information would just be phenomenal on our end.
Oh, okay. Well, we've been talking about this for a while, and you've gotten the job description and all of that, and we're going to need to move forward because we actually need to try and get that position filled. So we'll keep going and hope that at some point, you can check back in with us and let us know where you want to be with it. Okay, but we'll keep moving on it.
Great.
In terms of the information access, there was the draft of the MOU, and Linda Kingsley had done some work on it. Linda, let me just sort of preface it by saying we get caught. It seems like things just drag out. It just takes so very long to get everything done. And sometimes that we repeat our steps or miss a step and have to go back and just sort of extend the processes. But we just have to recognize that we need to move. We have to just keep moving. Linda?
Yes. You want me to just run through where?
Yeah.
Okay. Throughout the month of March and probably going back into February, there were a number of discussions with the administration, with the PAB, with me involved in it, about what an MOU would look like. In March, I put together, after meeting with the PAB leadership to talk to them about it, I put together a proposal that I thought encompassed all their issues. I brought it to the PAB leadership. They came back with some replies as to other concerns they had. I brought that back again to the law department on March 24th. Shawnee Mitchell was designated as the person to work on it. And on March 24th, we came to terms based on what at that time I knew the PAB's issues to be, with the understanding that it had to go back to the PAB board for approval. As you know, not to rehash old issues, which we've dealt with, I was unaware at that time, as was Shawnee Mitchell, that the PAB had retained outside counsel that would then have to opine on the agreement. On March 25th, I believe is the date when we found that out. I had conversations with Connor. I had conversations with Chair Wilson, and I indicated to them that I was happy to meet with the outside counsel to go over it with them, and that I would encourage them to encourage the outside counsel, who on March 25th had already been retained, to reach out to me. They did reach out to me after a number of days. On March 31st, I met with PAB's outside counsel. They indicated a number of changes they wished to have in the draft. I did express to them some concern about a number of those changes, but indicated to them that if they wished to pursue those changes, they needed to reach out to the law department and negotiate those changes. And that was something I had already told Connor and Chair Wilson would be my position, because I didn't think it was fruitful for me to be the one negotiating when I was no longer, clearly not the one who had the final say. As I said, that meeting was on March 31st. They indicated to me that they would reach out to her. I explained to them that it was important that they do it promptly, because I thought the city would not be forthcoming with documents to any great degree until these matters were resolved. I spoke to Shawnee Mitchell earlier today, and today, which is the 20th of April, 3 weeks later, she has still not heard from PAB's counsel. So first of all, you've got frustration in the law department that they're sitting there waiting and they have not heard back, which, given that the PAB outside counsel had a draft to show me on March 31st, I'm not sure why they have not reached out yet. And the other is to again reiterate, because you're now in this kind of document limbo, because the PAB has not signed or moved forward with the MOU, I am concerned that there may be issues getting access to documents should PAB need access, or should there be an incident where PAB is hoping to see unredacted footage, which we did agree, get the law department to agree to do. So the ball, I just want to be clear that the ball is in the PAB's court on this.
I'm happy to briefly respond. First, I just want to thank Linda Kingsley for all of the hard work that you put in to draft that agreement. Our counsel is, reviewing the document through our eyes, and when we have updates, we will provide them.
So the primary purpose, though, of reciting where we are is that during one of your comments, you mentioned just still waiting for information. And that is affected by what the agreement is about how the information would flow. So I want you to keep that in perspective, that in order to move on those things that you were talking about, it was the two cases that you're doing oversight on. I think Harris Street and the other one, you said that you still haven't gotten information that you had requested. So I'm not sure. It says in the charter that you guys are supposed to have what you asked for, and clearly it wasn't working like that, which is why we wanted to go the next step and make sure that we're all on the same page and that it's real clear how it goes, when it goes, to whom it goes, all of that, which was the purpose of the MOU. That makes it as clear as it could possibly be. And for that reason, I think it's pressing enough that we should try to move that along as quickly as possible.
I just want to say the PAB we are putting a lot of resources into this. I'm not going to, again, comment on the specifics on advice of counsel, but what I will say is that I think you nailed it, that this process started when the city was not following the charter rules about providing us with information. And so that's, where we are. And all I'll say is that, many civilian review boards have MOUs with their departments. And if you look at the detail and length of those MOUs, I think that you can have a sense of where some of these things go to have, firm, clear, detailed things. And that's just some context, additional context for, how MOU standard practice for these kind of MOUs. So again, I want to thank Linda for pulling that initial, document together and just say, we are working as quickly as possible to make sure that the city provides us with the information we need.
Okay. Were there any other comments or matters? Linda, your any other comments, council members, board members?
President Scott, I would just ask, what's the absolute deadline for this once we get this information to circle back with you, your team, or your for this For the MOU that we were talking about, or the process of, because I know you wanted to know something about if we were gonna have a, counsel from your office as well, or just from, if we were gonna use the same counsel. So you needed some information on that, or a decision on that. What's the absolute deadline for us getting back to you? Or are we past that?
We're basically past that. You were going to get back to me after our last meeting and let me know whether or not you wanted to participate in that process. So we've done the advertising, and we have applicants, and we'll start the interviews. So the person will be hired, and it will just keep moving. And at whatever point you want to engage, that'll be fine.
The job description will say, the civil service job description as it was proposed and as it was approved does allow for this person to do work for the PAB. So if at some point it's decided that that's in the PAB's best interest, that's not going to be a problem.
Okay, sounds good.
So you do have that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was sent over, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago.
Yeah, I provided my comments on it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So I thank everyone. I thank you for your work. I know that you guys put in a ton of hours on this, and that you're committed to seeing it be the best it could possibly be. I genuinely appreciate that. It's no small feat. So thank you, and we'll see you all again soon, and let's go celebrate the verdict.